I thought the most challenging thing about inheriting my grandmother's house in Yakutia would be the logistics, figuring out how to deal with property in one of the coldest inhabited places on Earth from my apartment in Moscow, 8 time zones away. I was wrong. The most challenging thing was what I discovered in the permafrost beneath that crumbling wooden structure, preserved perfectly in ice for 60 years, telling a story my grandmother had taken to her grave. I had no idea that the woman I'd visited every summer as a child, who'd fed me endless bowls of struganina and told me fairy tales by the fire, had been guarding a secret so dangerous that 3 different people tried to stop me from uncovering it. I had no idea that her run-down house was built deliberately over something that should have stayed buried forever. When the local police officer said, "Miss Volkov, you need to stop digging and leave Yakutsk immediately," I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the -40-degree temperature outside. But that officer didn't know who he was dealing with, because I'm not just my grandmother's granddaughter. I'm an investigative journalist who spent 5 years covering corruption cases in Siberia. And when people tell me to stop asking questions, it only makes me more determined to find answers. My grandmother Ekaterina died in January at the age of 93. I'd last seen her 2 years ago, before the pandemic made travel impossible, before her health declined to the point where she couldn't leave her bed. We'd spoken on the phone monthly, her voice growing weaker each time, her stories from the past becoming more vivid as her present faded. In our last conversation 3 weeks before she died, she'd said something strange. "Anya, when I'm gone, you must go to the house. Go to the cellar. You'll understand everything then. But be careful. There are people who don't want the truth known." I'd assumed it was the confusion of old age, the ramblings of a dying woman. But when her lawyer contacted me to say I'd inherited her property in Yakutsk, the small wooden house on the edge of town where she'd lived alone for 40 years, I remembered those words. The lawyer, an efficient woman named Svetlana Petrova, handled everything remotely. "The house is in poor condition," she warned. "It may be more practical to sell the land. The structure itself has little value." But something made me say, "I want to see it first." I arrived in Yakutsk in late March, when the worst of winter was loosening its grip, but temperatures still plunged to -30 at night. The city sprawled across the permafrost, its buildings elevated on stilts to prevent them from melting the frozen ground beneath, its streets a mix of Soviet-era apartment blocks and newer construction. My grandmother's house was a 20-minute drive from the center, in an older neighborhood where wooden houses with carved window frames stood alongside abandoned lots and crumbling fences. The house was exactly as I remembered from childhood visits: single-story, weathered blue paint peeling from wooden siding, a steep roof to shed snow, small windows with shutters. But it was smaller than my memories suggested, and more dilapidated. The front steps were rotting. The roof sagged in one corner. The yard was overgrown with dead vegetation from last summer. I stood in the frozen mud of the driveway, holding the keys Svetlana had given me, and felt a wave of sadness. This was all that remained of my grandmother's life, a dying house in a frozen city at the edge of the world. Inside, the house smelled of old wood and cold and the faint ghost of the cardamom tea my grandmother used to make. The furniture was sparse: a narrow bed with a faded quilt, a wood stove that had been her only source of heat, a small table and 2 chairs, shelves lined with books in Russian and Yakut. Everything was covered in a thin layer of dust. In the kitchen, I found jars of preserved berries and mushrooms my grandmother must have put up before she became too weak, labels in her careful handwriting marking the dates: summer 2024. She'd still been preparing for a future she wouldn't see. I spent that first day cleaning, making the house habitable enough to stay in while I decided what to do with it. The heating system still worked, powered by the wood stove, and I found enough split logs in the shed outside to last several days. As evening fell and temperatures dropped, I made tea and sat at my grandmother's table, looking through the books on her shelves. Most were in Russian, classic literature, Soviet-era histories, books on Yakut folklore. But one slim volume caught my attention. It was a journal, handmade, bound in cracked leather, with my grandmother's name inscribed on the first page, Ekaterina Mikhailovna Volkov, 1953. I opened it and began to read. The early entries were mundane, daily life in a remote Siberian settlement, weather observations, notes about neighbors and local events. But in May of 1953, the tone changed. "They brought him today," my grandmother had written, "the geologist from Moscow. He was barely alive when they carried him into the clinic. Dr. Sokolov says he's been shot, but not by a gun. Something else. Burns on his hands and face. Radiation, maybe. He keeps saying we have to seal it. We have to make sure nobody finds it. He's terrified." The entries over the following weeks documented my grandmother's care for this man. His name was Viktor Orlov, a geologist who'd been part of a Soviet expedition into the remote taiga. He'd been the only survivor. Whatever they'd found, whatever had happened to his team, had left him physically and psychologically shattered. "Victor says they discovered an anomaly," my grandmother wrote, "something in the permafrost that shouldn't exist. He won't tell me what, says it's too dangerous. That knowledge itself is contamination. But he's asked me to help him. He needs to bury evidence to make sure the site is never found again. He says lives depend on it." My hands were shaking as I read. Over the course of that summer in 1953, my grandmother and Victor had apparently conspired to hide something. The journal entries were vague about specifics, but clear about intent. "We buried the samples tonight," one entry read. "Victor dug deep into the permafrost layer beneath the house foundation. He says the cold will preserve everything indefinitely. He says if anyone ever needs to know, if the danger resurfaces, the evidence will be here, but he hopes it never comes to that." By September, Victor was gone. "He left today without saying goodbye," my grandmother wrote. "I found a note saying he's returning to Moscow to file his report, but he's leaving out certain details. He says our secret must be kept at all costs. He says the state would weaponize what they found, and that cannot happen. I'm afraid for him. I'm afraid for all of us." That was the last entry about Victor. The remaining pages of the journal returned to mundane details of daily life, as if those extraordinary months had never happened. But now I understood why my grandmother had told me to go to the cellar. Whatever Viktor Orlov had buried beneath this house in 1953 was still down there, waiting in the permafrost. The next morning, I went looking for the cellar entrance. It wasn't obvious. The house had been built without a traditional basement, like most structures in Yakutsk, to avoid disrupting the permafrost. But in a corner of the kitchen, beneath a worn rug, I found a wooden hatch. The hinges were frozen, and it took considerable effort to pry it open. Below was darkness and a rush of cold air that made the winter temperatures inside the house feel tropical by comparison. I lowered myself down with a flashlight. The space beneath the house was maybe 5 feet high, just enough to crouch, and extended under the entire structure. The ground was solid permafrost, frozen earth that had been solid for thousands of years. And in the far corner, exactly where my grandmother's journal suggested, I found evidence of digging. Someone had chipped away at the permafrost, creating a deep hole that had long since refrozen. But I could see something through the ice. Metal. A container of some kind. I spent the next 3 hours carefully melting the ice with a camping stove and hot water, working in that cramped, frozen space, my back screaming, my hands numb despite gloves. Finally, I freed it. A military-grade metal case, sealed and locked with faded Cyrillic lettering, property of Soviet Geological Survey Confidential. My heart was pounding as I brought it up into the house and set it on my grandmother's table. The lock was frozen solid. I had to heat it carefully with the wood stove before it would release. Inside the case, wrapped in oilcloth that had protected them from moisture for 6 decades, were documents, reports, photographs, sample containers, maps, and a letter addressed to whoever finds this. I recognized the handwriting from the journal entries, Victor Orloff's. The letter explained everything. In June of 1953, Victor's geological team had been surveying remote areas of eastern Yakutia for mineral deposits. They'd discovered an anomaly in the permafrost, a buried structure that their equipment suggested was artificial, made of materials that shouldn't exist, and exhibiting properties that defied physics as they understood it. Against protocol, they'd excavated. What they found had terrified them. Victor's letter didn't describe it in detail, but his fear was palpable on the page. This technology, if it falls into the wrong hands, could end humanity, he wrote. We took samples, we documented, and then we realized our mistake. The exposure killed my team within hours. I survived only because I stayed further back. I've buried the most dangerous samples and destroyed my team's bodies to prevent contamination. The site itself I've collapsed and hidden. The coordinates are in this case. I pray no one ever returns there. But if they do, if this is ever found, know this: what lies in that permafrost must never be disturbed. The documents included maps with coordinates, scientific reports I could barely understand filled with terms I'd never heard, and photographs. The photographs showed what looked like metallic fragments embedded in ice, geometric patterns that couldn't be natural, and in one image, something that made my blood run cold. A structure partially revealed by excavation, its surfaces smooth and angular, covered in markings that weren't Russian, weren't any language I recognized. I sat at that table for hours trying to process what I'd found. My rational mind said this was impossible, that Victor Orloff had been traumatized by some industrial accident and constructed a delusion. But the documents were real. The coordinates were real. And my grandmother had kept this secret for 60 years, had built her life around guarding this burial site because Victor had trusted her and she'd believed him. I made the mistake of asking questions in town. I showed the photographs to a local historian, claiming they were family artifacts I didn't understand. I mentioned Victor Orloff's name to an elderly librarian, asking if she remembered a geologist by that name from the 1950s. Within 2 days, I received the visit from the police officer, a nervous man in his 50s named Captain Dmitry Sokolov, apparently the grandson of the doctor who'd treated Victor. "You need to stop," he said, standing in my grandmother's kitchen, looking at the metal case on the table with recognition and fear. My grandfather told me stories before he died, about the geologist who came back alone from the taiga, about the secret your grandmother kept. He said it was dangerous, that there were people in Moscow who would kill to keep it hidden or to exploit it. "Miss Volkov, please. Seal that case back up. Bury it again. Leave Yakutsk and forget you ever found it." I asked, "What happened to Victor Orloff?" Captain Sokolov's face was grim. He filed his official report in Moscow. 3 months later, he died in a car accident that wasn't an accident. His entire team's records were classified and disappeared. The expedition was officially recorded as a failed mineral survey. But my grandfather said Victor had told him the truth before he left, that there are things in the Siberian permafrost that humanity isn't ready for, that the Soviet state would weaponize anything it found, consequences be damned. Victor died to keep that from happening. I looked at the case, at Victor's letter, at the photographs of something that shouldn't exist, and I made a decision. "I'm a journalist," I told Captain Sokolov. "This story needs to be told." He shook his head. "You'll end up like Victor Orloff. There are still people watching, still people who remember. The Soviet Union may be gone, but the agencies that handled these secrets are not." I said, "Then they'll have to stop me." Over the next 2 weeks, I worked with contacts from my journalism days to authenticate the documents, to research Victor Orloff's expedition, to piece together what had happened in the summer of 1953. What I learned was disturbing. Multiple geological expeditions in remote Yakutia during the early 1950s had ended in mysterious deaths or disappeared entirely. Reports mentioned unusual findings and anomalous readings before going silent. Victor's expedition was just one of many that had apparently encountered something in the permafrost, but his was the only one where evidence had survived. I tried to locate the coordinates Victor had documented using modern satellite imagery. The site was in one of the most remote, inaccessible regions of Yakutia, hundreds of kilometers from any settlement. But in recent satellite photos from 2024, I could see something that made my pulse quicken. Fresh excavation, heavy equipment tracks, temporary structures. Someone had found Victor's site. Someone was digging. I published my article in early April. It went viral immediately, picked up by international news outlets, discussed on social media, analyzed by scientists and skeptics alike. The photographs especially captivated people. Whatever was in that permafrost didn't look like any known artifact or natural formation. Within hours of publication, I received threatening messages, warnings to retract the story, accusations of fabrication. And I received one message that stood out from the rest. It was from an email address that immediately self-destructed after I read it. Your grandmother protected this secret because she understood the stakes. Viktor Orlov died for it. Are you prepared to do the same? The excavation you found is Chinese. They're racing to extract what's there before the permafrost melts. If they succeed, the balance of power shifts forever. You've drawn attention to something that should have stayed hidden. Now there's no going back. The Russian government officially denied everything, called my article sensationalist fiction, threatened me with legal action for damaging national interests. But privately, I received a visit from an FSB agent who offered me a choice: retract the article and accept protective custody while they secured the site or face arrest on fabricated charges. I chose neither. Instead, I released everything. All of Victor's documents, all the photographs, all the coordinates, publicly to multiple international organizations simultaneously. If this was going to end badly for me, it wouldn't be because the secret died with me. The international response was swift and chaotic. The UN called for an investigation. China denied any excavation activities in Russian territory. Environmental groups demanded protection of the site. Scientists wanted access to study whatever was there. And in the midst of all this geopolitical maneuvering, I sat in my grandmother's house in Yakutsk, burning the last of the firewood, and understood what she'd been trying to tell me. Some secrets are kept not to hide the truth, but to protect the world from it. Some mysteries are better left buried in the permafrost. Some inheritances are burdens, not gifts. It's been 3 months now. I'm writing this from a location I can't disclose, under protection from journalists' organizations and international human rights groups. The house in Yakutsk burned down mysteriously 2 weeks after I left. Officially an electrical fire, but I know better. The site Viktor Orlov discovered remains contested, with Russian military now securing the area and international pressure mounting for transparency. Several scientific teams have analyzed the photographs and documents I released. Their conclusions range from evidence of pre-human civilization to remnants of secret Soviet weapons testing to elaborate hoax. Nobody knows for certain. Maybe nobody ever will. What I know is this. My grandmother spent 60 years guarding a secret that terrified a Soviet geologist enough to fake evidence, destroy records, and ultimately sacrifice his life. She built her house over that burial site, lived there alone for 4 decades, turned down every offer to relocate, because Viktor Orlov had trusted her with something he believed was more important than personal comfort or safety. And when she was dying, she passed that burden to me, knowing I would do what she couldn't, bring it into the light, whatever the consequences. I don't know if I did the right thing. I don't know if the world is better or worse for knowing that something impossible might be buried in the Yakutian permafrost, preserved by ice for uncountable years, now exposed as climate change melts the frozen earth. I don't know if my grandmother would be proud or horrified that I broke the silence she maintained for a lifetime. But I know I couldn't do what she did. I couldn't spend 60 years keeping a secret that might matter to humanity's understanding of itself, of its history, of what else might be hidden in the vast frozen regions of our planet. The run-down house I inherited from my grandma is gone now, reduced to ash and memory. But what was beneath it? What Victor Orlov buried there in 1953? What my grandmother protected until her death? What I released to the world despite every warning? That remains. Buried in permafrost or excavated by governments, analyzed by scientists or weaponized by nations, it exists. And nothing I do or say now can change that. Sometimes I think about those summer visits to Yakutsk as a child, playing in my grandmother's yard while she watched from the porch, her eyes distant, her mind clearly elsewhere. I thought she was just old, just tired, just worn down by harsh Siberian winters and a hard life. Now I know she was standing guard. Every day for 40 years, she was protecting something she believed was worth protecting, keeping a promise to a dying geologist who'd trusted her with the most dangerous knowledge of his life. I inherited more than a house from my grandmother. I inherited her burden, her secret, her promise. And I broke that promise because I believe in transparency, in truth, in the public's right to know. But late at night, when I think about what might happen if the wrong people access whatever is in that permafrost, I wonder if my grandmother was right, if Victor Orlov was right, if some truths are too dangerous for a world that hasn't learned wisdom to match its curiosity. The house is gone. The secret is out. And I'm left with questions that may never be answered, living with consequences I can't yet fully understand. That's what happened in the rundown house in Yakutia my grandmother left me. Not just the discovery of buried artifacts and hidden history, but the understanding that inheritance sometimes means accepting responsibility for choices made by people you loved, in times you'll never fully comprehend, for reasons that seemed right to them, even if we might choose differently. And somewhere in remote eastern Yakutia, in permafrost that's melting faster every year, something that shouldn't exist continues to exist, waiting, preserved. A mystery my grandmother spent her life protecting, that Victor Orlov died for, that has now been exposed to a world that may not be ready for what it means. That's my inheritance. That's my legacy. That's what happened in that frozen house at the edge of the world.